Hey everyone, this is Pastor Bob, and it's time for our midweek message. And today we are going to look at why we visit the sick. That's a question a lot of people have, and it's a command to all Christians found in Matthew 25 and James 5 and so on and so forth. But it's a practice, one of the ways we as Christians practice our faith. But to look at this one, I think we need to go back and look at the original scriptures in their context. Matter of fact, anytime you interpret scripture, one of the first things that you should always do when trying to understand what the author is intending the reader to hear is to study it in its original context. Now, the reason for that is because the world 2,000 years ago or longer was a lot different than the world we live in today. And so to first understand the passage, we have to exegete the passage, meaning study it in its original context, and then to apply it today, that's a theological process we call hermeneutics. We have to first understand it in its original context and apply it in a way that makes sense or that is biblically faithful today in the modern world in our context. And so we're going to do that with visiting the sick. We're going to take a look at it in its original context, look how the meaning and practice has changed throughout the ages, and then hopefully offer a couple tips for us visiting the sick today. So first, in the ancient world, at the time this was written, a couple things. One, they had no idea what diseases were. They didn't know what bacteria was, what viruses were. Somebody could get cut with a metal implement. They didn't have tetanus shots. They didn't know how to stop infections. I mean, you could literally die from that cut. Matter of fact, the average lifespan all the way up until 1920, I think, was 35. So it was a very scary and very real time. And so when you got sick, it was a big deal. The other thing we have to remember, too, is in the ancient world, life was very hard. Most people were agrarian. 98% of the population worked on farms. That's very different today. Over the last 70, 80 years, what we've seen happen here in the western half of the world is people have moved from the rural areas to the cities for jobs or for work. And so back then you had 98% agrarian. Today you have 98% city or urban. And in today's world, we're seeing rural areas evaporate or diminish as younger people are moving on to the cities for work. But in the ancient world, it was still a very agrarian economy. And what you did in the ancient world in order to survive, but for other reasons, but primarily survival, is you had big families. Big families meant lots of workers, which meant more you could get done, more food you could harvest, more wood you could chop to get through the winter. It meant survival. And it was a very real concern. One bad year or one bad illness, and you could be done. And so when people got sick, it literally took a village. You know, let's say somebody gets sick and they're the primary, I don't want to say breadwinner back then, but the primary task person on the farm. It may take a village to help them get enough done on the farm just to get through the winter. I mean, it was a hard life. I mean, even just imagine this, to do laundry. Today we take a basket and dump it in a thing and push a button. In the ancient world, if you wanted to do laundry, you had to chop the wood, build the fire, go down a mile to the creek, fill up a bucket of water, carry it all the way back, do it again so that you had a bucket to rinse. I mean, everything was really difficult. And when somebody got sick, you needed that local support to help the family survive, even bigger families, depending on who got sick and or if it was multiple people. So the command to visit the sick had a very practical meaning in the ancient world. Now, it still had the spiritual component. You did want to pray for that person, just like Jesus did. I'm a firm believer that God does heal, but I'm also a realist and realize that most of the time he doesn't. If God always healed, we wouldn't need hospital, and medical care wouldn't be a full third of our gross domestic product. But God does heal, and I trust that in his providence and his wisdom, that when I pray for somebody, whether I'm at home or visiting them or wherever, God, heal this person. I'd love you to do that. and I just trust in his will, that whatever happens is his will, but I'm at least asking him on behalf of me or anybody else that's praying for him to heal. So you had two components. You had the very practical component, and then you had the spiritual component. What changed is about the 4th or 5th century, the western half of the church, the Roman Catholic Church, started taking over more and more of a person's life. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, there's a passage, and this isn't related to visiting the sick. This is just an example, an allusion. There's a passage where Jesus says to Peter, "What you have bound on earth shall be bound in heaven. What you have loosed on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And the church decided to take that literally. And so they believe we hold the keys to heaven. Matter of fact, if you go to the Vatican today, you'll see the symbol of the keys throughout your trip there. And the belief was that they controlled who could get into heaven, who could not, and therefore they could, based on the treasury of merit, Google that, grant absolution from sin, thus a person could avoid purgatory, another Roman Catholic belief, and go straight to heaven. And the church did that with many things, like in the 13th century. Before the 13th century, churches did not regulate who got married, or they didn't have rites or ceremonies. It was a private family affair. But the 13th century, in order to gain control of the chessboard of Europe and who could marry who and what king could marry who and whether they could get divorced or not, look up Henry VIII, the famous story of a battle between a monarch and the church on whether they could get divorced or not. Anyway, the church started getting more and more control, and so what the church started doing was, for visiting the sick, they added a component, and it's namely this: if we hold the keys to heaven and we can grant absolution, then when somebody is sick, and chances are in the ancient world, if they were sick, the probability of them dying was fairly high. It's kind of scary. It's not like today. That the priest needs to be there to hear their confession, grant absolution so they could get into heaven. So it went from this command of all Christians to visit the sick to the priest needs to be there to hear confession, grant absolution, which only the church can do, so that they could avoid purgatory and go straight to heaven. And so for a long time, the idea that a priest or a pastor needs to be there was very prominent, and still is in some circles today. So anyway, zoom forward to the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation. One of the things the Protestant Reformation intended to do was to get rid of a lot of the theology of the Middle Ages, some of which was good, much of which was bad, but to get rid of the theology of the Middle Ages and reform the church. That's why it's called the Reformation, and get back to the meaning and understanding of the early church. So the idea of visiting the sick went back to, hey, this is a very practical thing. We need to support each other on these farms when somebody goes down, and we need everyone to pray for that person in case God wants to heal them. So the understanding changed, although within the Roman Church it is still the same. I have a lot of Roman Catholic friends. Matter of fact, I have a bachelor's degree in Catholic systematic theology, and so I'm familiar with the tradition. I have a lot of respect for it, although I don't necessarily agree with it. But a lot of Catholics still believe if you get sick or if you're getting ready to die, the priest needs to be there. And that is kind of rubbed off into Protestants, where many Protestants believe that as well. But as Protestants, our official position, regardless of the denomination, is that there is no mediator between us and God other than Jesus Christ. You don't need a priest there. You don't need to have a confession heard. It's between you and God. But so the understanding of the visiting the sick commandment has changed quite a bit. Now let's fast forward to today. Today, a full third of our GDP almost is spent on medical care. When you go to the hospital, you're surrounded by the latest technology and equipment and advances in medical science. You're surrounded by specialists like cardiologists and endocrinologists and psychiatrists and social workers. I mean, it is huge. And life is easier. We don't need a village to help. I mean, If you're at home, you call up Uber Eats or pop something in the microwave. I mean, it's a whole different world. So the village aspect isn't there as far as a practical component. And the healing part, we still expect God to heal. We still ask God to heal. At least I do. I'm a big believer in the healing power of prayer, although I'm a realist and understand most of the time God doesn't heal. That's why we have hospitals. That's how we carry on the ministry of Jesus in a practical way. And that's why churches run hospitals, because we realize God doesn't always heal, so we're going to give it a shot. We wouldn't have modern hospitals today if it wasn't for Christianity. And anyway, conversation for another time. So today, the command to visit the sick is really more about comfort and about praying for the person, asking God to intercede. And the praying part, honestly, you can do that from anywhere. Your location has no bearing on whether a prayer will work or not, or whether it's heard. So really more it's about comfort, if anything else. And it used to be, even in the 1800s, this belief that the pastor needed to be there, and there were a lot of small country churches, and that's a discussion for another time. But today, in all the hospitals, we have chaplains. We have a spiritual care department in nearly every hospital, whether it is secular or religious. All of them have a spiritual care department. There are chaplains on staff that not only help you with prayer, but can help you navigate hospital systems and work through some of the paperwork you may have to sign and things like that. So there's still pastors available, and some church pastors visit. That really has to do with the size of your church. In churches over 100 in worship, it's a lot harder for a pastor to visit unless they have a specific pastor of pastoral care. If you're in a small church, it might be easier, but if you're in a church of 500 or 1,000, it may not happen. But the command, honestly, is for everyone. And so a lot of churches have Stephen's ministries or hospital ministries of people from the church that go out and visit. And that is actually more biblical, because Matthew 25:36, the command to visit the sick is for everyone. So anyway, that's a little bit of the context and the history and kind of where we're at today. Let me talk practically about visiting people in case you feel called to visit the sick. I've met a lot of folks that like visiting the sick, but they always tell me this: I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do. And a couple things. One, there's not a lot you can do. As a visitor, you can't write a prescription. You're not a family member. You can't even ask what's going on because of HIPAA laws. You can ask the patient, but you can't ask the nurses or whatever. There's not a lot you can do. But what you can do is go and be a presence and offer prayer. It's not hard. There's no magical words you can say that are going to make them feel better. That's another myth we believe, that there's some magic words that we can say that's just going to make everything right again. And there's not a lot you can do, but you can offer God's love and presence. So a few tips on visits. Number one, ask before you go. Believe it or not, because we are surrounded by technology today and we don't need a village to help with the farm, a lot of people don't want visits. They might have been woke up every hour on the hour. They might not feel well. They may not have their makeup on. They feel undignified in this loose-fitting hospital gown with nothing on underneath. A lot of people don't want visits, so call and ask first just to be sure. And if they do want to visit, and maybe it's from the chaplain, I mean, they're pretty surrounded. I'm in the hospital, not this August, but last August. I had my encounter with a heart issue. It was pretty serious, and I was in the hospital for 4 days. And I know they had me up every hour. I didn't sleep the entire time I was there. And I had people say, "Do you want to visit?" And I said, "No, I don't. And I don't feel good. I feel tired. I feel crabby. I'm afraid I might snap at someone." As I was pretty miserable, and I was hooked up to all kinds of things, and it was just not a fun experience. And the other reason I didn't want visits, because I know how hospitals work. I wanted to get out of there. And I have seen it in hospitals where they're coming to pick you up for a test, and there's people in the room, and the test people will say, oh, we're sorry, we'll come back later. I'm like, no, don't come back later. Don't put me back at the end of the line. Let's do this now. I want to go home. I didn't want, I wanted to get in and out. I didn't want visitors, as well-intentioned as they may be, delaying, so I have to stay extra days because they were there. And so call first, make sure somebody wants to visit. And sometimes a phone call is nice, just to show you care. I mean, that's worth a million hearts right there. Just showing your care is really a big deal. And then the second part I would give you as a practical matter, as a bit of advice if you want to visit, keep it short. Folks are tired, they don't feel good. They're there to heal and rest, not to entertain or long conversations. They probably want to sleep, they're probably on medications, they're probably hooked up to IVs and monitors that never fit right, never quit beeping. Keep it short. It doesn't have to be a long thing. In seminary, I remember they said never do a visit more than 30 minutes. And that's probably a really good idea. Any more than that, you're probably becoming a burden. Now, family members may want to do that. That's okay. But as a visitor from the church, being a good Christian, bringing a little comfort, keep it short. Let them get rest. Stay out of the way of the doctors. Stay out of the way of the nurses. They're going to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner brought to them. If the breakfast comes in, leave. And that reminds me, the third tip I would give you too is if you're visiting and a doctor or a nurse comes in and starts asking questions, politely excuse yourself. Here's why. I have seen this many times. When doctors and nurses are coming in, they're asking questions which could be of personal nature. And the patient, the person you're visiting, may or may not feel like divulging certain things in front of you, whether it's embarrassing or whatever. Who knows? It's none of our business. So whenever a doctor or nurse or somebody comes in, say politely excuse yourself and say, hey, I'll come back a little later. Let them have private time with the people in charge of their care. That is extremely important, that there's no information lost in translation, or they really wanted to tell the doctor something, but they didn't feel like they could because somebody was in the room. So keep it short, excuse yourself if medical professionals come in, and again, call and make sure they actually want to visit. There's a lot of people don't, and if it's something outpatient, there may not be time. They're going to get you in a pre-op, they're going to get you hooked up, they're going to get you done, you're going to be home. If it's an outpatient thing, there may not even be time for a visit. So call first, check ahead. Anyway, hopefully covers a little bit of why we do that, and looking at should you decide to fulfill the ministry of visitation, practical ways to do that, and hopefully answers altogether why we do that. All right, thanks. Bye.